maybe you don't totally understand how bad this was. You know, he's talked about it for like 7 pages. And by this point, you're like, I get it. It wasn't a good thing. He so needs to drive home the point with you that this was bad that he decides to offer up one of the most paltry little analogies you've maybe ever heard. He writes, it demonstrated that Charles and the institution still hadn't grasped the power of social media and the internet. A fact that frankly seems blindly incompetent at best. Think of it this way. Imagine if Apple had decades to roll out a revolutionary new successor to the iPhone, one they'd spent a great deal of time and money hyping up as an emblem of the next generation of communication, and then clumsily unveiled, with great fanfare, a throwback temperamental flip phone riddled with software bugs, and doing so while somehow unaware that they were under a microscope. What kind of analogy is that? That's not at all what this was. Hello, how are you? Welcome to my channel. My name is Cheer Denise, and today we're going to be reading Chapter 3 of Endgame. This is Omid Scobie's book about why he thinks that it's the end of all things for the royal family. The last couple of chapters were not super stimulating, if you ask me, because it was just me being like, what's he even talking about? What's he even talking about? That's crazy. And it is crazy. I mean, he is just blabbing on and on, with no care whatsoever about the fact that the book is extremely biased in his direction. And it just reads as a very catty book. So it's like, if he wants to be taken seriously as a person who's going to write the definitive book on this, he's going to need to grow up and have a different tone of voice, because this doesn't read as anything that is going to be historically significant. It is going to be the absolute footnote on a footnote on a footnote. So, and there's a part of me that just wants to be like, this is a dumb book. I don't want to finish it. But since we're waiting for better things to come in the mail, we're just going to plod through this a little bit. Now, a thing happened to me as I was reading this next chapter, which shocked me to my very core, and that is this. I actually agreed with a couple of points he made. Don't stone me, everybody, but I don't actually think there's any of us who are really scratching our heads, or who will be really scratching our heads on this either. I think actually the majority of us would take this same stance that he did. So again, he's not exactly breaking the mold, but to agree with Omid Scobie makes me feel like I'm really dancing on that third rail. I'm not, because a broken clock is right twice a day. Now, this chapter is called, Oh God, I Hate This. Me too, man. But this chapter refers to Prince Charles and his little hissy fit that he had when he sat down and the pen was leaking everywhere. And then just like a couple of times when he kind of showed us that he indeed is human. And well, Omid Scobie does go to great lengths to point out that he's grumpy and he's nothing like his mom. I think that he kind of beat that dead horse to the ground, even though I kind of do see what he's saying. I don't think that the king tried to refrain his petulant tones, and I think that that is not a credit to him, but I think you can say that and then move on. Like, there are bigger fish to fry here. But I guess when you're writing a book that's really supposed to sink the monarchy, when you have one story that is pretty equally agreed upon as not super great for the look of the royal family, I guess he just felt like he needed to really spend a lot of time with that under the microscope. So he does that. We're not going to pay it as much mind as he does. We talk about Frogmore Cottage and how they decided to take that away from Harry and Meghan. We go into some detail there. And then the final thing that we talk about is the situation with Andrew and how he's still hanging around and he still has a couple of things that he does, jobs that the Queen bestowed upon him, and never seemed to think that she should take those away from him. And I think that her love for Andrew was maybe her worst quality. Because while I think mother's love is really important, this is a grown man who's made some grown man bad decisions. And it doesn't matter how much you love a person. You can still love them and completely disagree with what they've done. I'm not saying you have to renounce him as your son. I'm not saying you have to like take him out behind the woodshed and shoot him. But what I'm saying is, this guy has made some decisions that are so egregious and look so bad on the family that to keep him close is problematic. And to give him any chance to dress up as a royal and parade himself around in any capacity is an embarrassment to the royal family. Like, they do not need that joker around. Now, William and Catherine do seem like they recognize the fact that that guy needs to be as far away from them as is possible to get. So you'll see that whenever he's in the picture, they really try to edge away. But some of the older members of the family just don't seem to really take it that seriously. And I just think that you guys, I'm not in the business of wanting to criticize the royal family. You know I like the monarchy as an institution. As an American, I like it as much as an American can. But I just think that sometimes we need to pull our heads out of the sand and, call a spade, and that Joker is a pedophile. So let's call him one. Omid Scobie, like I said, has entitled Chapter 3, Oh God, I Hate This. And he starts the story out with September 13th, 2022, when King Charles had gone to a remembrance service for his mother. It was all a very pleasant setting. He writes that with an audience present solely to commemorate the late Queen and honor their new sovereign, Charles couldn't constrain his frustration and legendary irascibility. While signing the castle's visitor's book, he suddenly lost his cool, throwing what can only be called a petulant temper tantrum. His target? A leaky fountain pen. Caught on video, it was an amusing but revealing scene. Sitting at an antique wooden desk dressed up with a vase of lilies and a gold royal accoutrement, Charles, already cranky from writing in the wrong date, now faced the calamity of a malfunctioning pen. Noticing the leaky ink, he blurted out, "Oh God, I hate this pen," after he stood up and brusquely handed it to his queen, who was equally irked. "Oh, look, it's going everywhere." The new king grumpily wiped his fingers. He was almost to the point of stamping his feet when he said through gritted teeth, "I can't bear this bloody thing every stinking time." Shoving his inky handkerchief into his pocket, Charles left the room in a grumble while Camilla sat calmly down and signed the book. She did what most of us would have done in that situation. A simple solution, really. She just used another pen.
Oh, look, it's going everywhere. Hang on. So nobody got it wrong. Oh, look, it's everywhere.
Now, the reality is this is worthy of criticism, but it's also pretty low-hanging fruit when you're trying to criticize the royal family. I feel like for an instance that has already been roundly picked apart, of course you can mention it in a book. If the whole point of the book is to say, look at these jokers, they can't hold a candle to his mom, sure, you would have to include this episode. But you need to go deeper than this. Like, this can't be what you're hanging your hat on. And it kind of feels like he is, because he goes on for like 5 more pages about it. We're not going to. But he just keeps bringing it up and bringing it up. And that's one of the things about Omid Scobie, is that he will say, like, he will take a chapter and then he will reiterate the same thing about 7 different ways, but he's not ever making any new points. Now, as a person who also talks too much and says the same thing 7 different ways, I can really sense it when I see it. And you know how, like, your worst traits you notice in others? Well, I see that Omid Scobie shares the same tendency I have to keep saying the same thing, but not in a new way. And that's a fault that I have that I know. I've edited enough of my stuff to know I do that. But the difference is, where was his editor? Why wasn't somebody like ///? You've already said this. Okay, so he goes on, like I said, for quite a long time. King, and people kept wanting to compare him to his mother. Omid says, let's not forget also that Prince Philip was his dad, and this was a real Prince Philip moment. I don't really know much about Prince Philip, if I'm 100% honest with you. I know the Queen really cared for him and loved him and thought he was great, so I've always just taken that as all I needed to know. If he was prickly and interesting, okay. But I think that it would be nice to have a person in the family like that who doesn't always do and say the exact right thing, because that makes life interesting. All right, but he keeps on about the point, about the pen. Then he says that, to make matters worse, a mere 48 hours after the Queen's death, while signing the historic proclamation of his new position as King in Henry VIII's St. James Palace, Charles furiously gestured to his private secretary, Clive Alderton, to remove a tray of pens, bloody stationery again, and an inkpot, which was an old gift from his sons, baring his teeth in a grimace as he nearly pushed the lot off the desk. Naturally, with little concern for optics, he did this with the world watching and waiting to see the new king in action. Online clips and headlines quickly followed. Despite the occasion's solemnity, there was the new monarch publicly making a fuss over a frivolity, bungling his special moment by flashing his temper during the official proceedings for his own ascension, while signing his very first document as king. Again, could one expect a person writing a book against the royal family wouldn't mention these things? Of course, so I'm not like shocked. I'm not clutching my chest like, how could you mention this? How could he talk ugly? Because the truth is, these moments did not reflect well on Charles. And I think that the reality is that if any of us had to ascend the throne after such a class act as his mother, who reigned and ruled beautifully for 70 years, I think all of us would suffer from some extreme anxiety, especially when our temperament was so different from hers. So already I think the anxiety of the moment would lead you to feel on edge, and probably if you did suffer from sort of like, if temper was kind of your thing, like you kind of had a problem with your temper, this wouldn't be the best environment in which to sort of cull that. And I think that to continually say, why aren't you your mom? Why aren't you your mom? That's not really fair, because he's not his mom. Did he ever promise us that he would be? His entire, like, leading up to becoming king, he kept talking about how he wanted to make it different. He wanted the monarchy to be slimmed down and reflect more modernity. So I don't think people need to be shocked and chagrined that he isn't his mom. And I think people need to let him do his own thing. But doing your own thing does not mean that you have temper tantrums and that you act foolishly when something is mildly inconvenient. I think that it was right for people to call him out. I think he needed a reminder that he's not a prince anymore. He is now a king. So you know, whatever little bursts of irritability that you may have been able to get away with before, you are under a microscope now. And people do want to see differently now. You don't have to be like your mom, but if your mom was known for being calm, cool, and collected, and people are still grieving that sense of stability that she brought to an unstable world, you may be unlike her in every respect. But the one place for you to come dancing out and showing, you know, your personality should not be in irritability and unstable emotional outbursts. People are not opposed to change necessarily with what you're going to do with the monarchy, but people want your personality to be one that feels trustworthy, and freaking out several times in, 48-hour span of each other about pens that inconvenience you, that's not a great look. So I'm not surprised that Omid Scobie had something to say about it. And I agree that it wasn't a good look for Charles. I just think that Omid is leaning too heavily on this example because it can't be denied it was a bad look. But he really, really, really needs you to buy that this shows that Charles is incapable of doing the job. And I just don't agree with that. Just when you're like, how much longer is he going to drag these two sad little stories along? He so needs to drive home the point with you that this was bad that he decides to offer up one of the most paltry little analogies you've maybe ever heard. He writes, it demonstrated that Charles and the institution still hadn't grasped the power of social media and the internet. A fact that frankly seems blindly incompetent at best. Think of it this way. Imagine if Apple had decades to roll out a revolutionary new successor to the iPhone, one they'd spent a great deal of time and money hyping up as an emblem of the next generation of communication, and then clumsily unveiled, with great fanfare, a throwback temperamental flip phone riddled with software bugs, and doing so while somehow unaware that they were under a microscope and it was the mercy of trends, unceasing opinion, and the New World Order's outrage machine. What kind of analogy is that? That's not at all what this was. This was somebody who was grieving his mother and acted out temperamentally because he was under so much strain, stress, anxiety, and grief. Somebody freaking out about a pen that's leaking all over their hands while they're dressed for a very somber occasion and, don't want to be covered with ink. That's not the same thing as Apple telling us they had something better than the iPhone and then giving us an old flip phone that's full of software bugs. That's not even a close analogy as to what this was. Not even kind of. And that is when I was just like, all right, man, you really overstepped your bounds here. This could have been a point in the book where you would have had a lot of people going, you know what, he is right. If he'd scaled back the criticism and then didn't end it with this phony baloney foolishness. Okay. Then, so this is supposed to make us all feel better. He says that a lot of people tried to brush off the blunders of King Charles by saying that it was nothing more than harmless gaffes, all of those of President Joe Biden. And, it's just a little bit of grouchiness. Okay, I don't think that any of us are going like, oh, that didn't age well now that we know that Joe Biden is not mentally competent. Now that we're all willing to admit that. But even way back in the day, 4 years ago, those of us who were paying attention whatsoever knew that Joe Biden was not mentally competent to do the job of president. And, it wasn't just one side of media saying this. There was a couple of people willing to be honest about the fact that Joe Biden didn't seem well. And every other country in the world, everyone was like, is that guy okay? So for anybody to try to comfort themselves by saying, oh, King Charles is just the same as Joe Biden. It's just a little gaffe, little faux pas, just a little, little nothing. Don't worry about it. If I had been King Charles and I heard anybody compare me to Joe Biden, I would have flipped out. You want to talk about being upset? That would have upset me. For anybody to compare me and be like, oh, he's just as, it's just at the same level of competency. I would have just died 1,000 deaths. All right, well, to continue on, he was annoyed, apparently, says the insiders, and according to Omid Scobie, so how much can we believe this? But apparently it really annoyed King Charles to always have people say, well, the Queen would have done it that way, or the Queen would have done this, or she didn't like that. And it didn't help that so early in his reign, sources close to the king claimed that he was already a little frustrated by the burden of the daily red box paper shuffling and rubber stamping, the executive work that Queen Elizabeth relished and considered an anchoring component of her position. Right out of the gate, Charles was a little overwhelmed by it all, easily irked, and perhaps even a bit wistful for his former job as heir apparent and the freedom it provided. Although he had official duties as Prince of Wales, he was less restricted to express frustration or passion, and in some cases he was free to crusade for issues like sustainability in the private sector and alternate medicines. As the new role transforms him, the job requiring quiet forbearance instead of vigorous debate, the opinionated activist prince must retreat behind the stately remove of the king's throne. Adopt, adapt, and abide, just like his mother did. Apparently he's chafed by that. Everything's going wrong, is what this book is basically saying. He can't do the job without throwing a fit, and also he's just super annoyed by everybody bringing up his mom all the time because he wants to do it his own way. Leave me alone. But one of the things that really became a struggle between Charles and the government, because he's got quite a struggle ahead of him, and this goes on for 4 pages, of which I'm going to skip, but I'll give you the end bit. One of his new struggles now is not just the fact that pens are leaking all over himself and everyone keeps throwing a red box at him full of papers he has to rubber stamp. One of the issues now is that he does not want the coronation to be this super big, showy, expensive affair. He wants a very streamlined, stripped down coronation because he thought that the public would accept that more than the royals with all their pomp showing, this huge regal event and just wasting a bunch of the taxpayers' money. That's how he was afraid it would look. And so he didn't want to do something like that. He thought that he was really giving the public what they wanted. The government, however, was like, no. We're going to have a big thing here. This is a big deal. Okay, we want all the pomp. We want all the elegance. We want all the regality. We want it all. And so do the people too. So don't cheat us out of that good time we've all been wanting to have. The kids around here are all too little to be expect a wedding out of them anytime soon. The next Jubilee is going to be in 25 years. When is our next royal event going to be? None that we can see. So let's have a good time while we can. So they fought about that back and forth. Charles still thinking that it would look better if they weren't wasting money, as he saw it, and the government still saying, no, we want our own way. So that whole conversation is tied together by this last paragraph that says, while Charles wanted to downsize, Sunak and Whitehall, the government, envisioned a full fat celebratory weekend, the full Monty of carriages, a big concert, a national celebration. The firm saw the coronation as a chance to exude importance through prudence and sensitivity. But the government wanted to distract and redirect by way of extravagance and ballyhoo. It was a 2-for-1 deal. A good old-fashioned royal performance would divert public attention from the crisis at home. The pre-coronation media hype would dominate the news cycle for months and stimulate an image repair process for Britain on the global stage. A source said it was the Queen's funeral that reminded Sunak and other ministers that a proper royal occasion draws an international audience like no other and puts a momentary gloss on reality. The government stance was to harness this moment. The country could use a little bit of brand Britain and the public some entertaining diversion. So, in the end, the king acquiesced to the demands of the government and had the big ceremony that they wanted. I don't think that was a bad idea. I never really could figure out what Scobie was trying to get at there. Just that there was tensions between Charles and the government. He never really seems like he took a real hard stance on that. I mean, he does seem like he kind of thought the government, untrustworthy fools that they are, were just trying to distract the people from the fact they can't afford anything. And again, he's not completely wrong. But at the same time, if you're going to have a monarchy and you're going to have the royals as part of your culture, why not give the people what they want? People love a royal celebration. It's fun. It's unusual. It's different. You don't get to do these things all the time. It's not just Great Britain that enjoys it. It is the entire world. Everyone gets excited about this little bit of distraction. And I don't think that that's an evil thing to enjoy, beauty and the elegance and the grandeur of an event. There's nothing wrong with that. So many pages are so boring that literally I was sitting by the pool trying to read this, falling asleep, just dead out falling asleep. Anyway, to pick up on a subject that was of slight more interest. Let's talk about what's going on with Frogmore Cottage. So apparently, while gathering at Sandringham, Princess Anne suggested to Charles that it was time he took away the Sussex's Frogmore Cottage home and Prince Andrew's Royal Lodge residence. He knew that she was right, said a source, who noted that Anne's comments would have been related to the fact that Harry and Meghan, and Andrew for that matter, were no longer working royals, rather than suggesting that they'd be punished by taking away these properties from them. So it wasn't like Princess Anne was being like, let's really get these losers. But it was more like they are not working royals, so they should not have access to these royal homes any longer. And, you know, these properties that belong, I guess to some royal trust, I don't exactly understand how the properties work, are shuffled around amongst the family members. So if you're not here, that home can be going to somebody else in the family. I think that's how it works. You'll correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure. You will recall that at the same time, right ahead of Spare's release, Harry had an interview with Tom Bradby, who was a journalist and a friend of his. And in that interview, he detailed his estrangement with his family and told ITV news anchor that he was not sure whether he would attend his father's coronation. And then the next day, he had an interview with Anderson Cooper, again, prior to his book Spare coming out. And that interview was notable for two things: Harry's candidness and Cooper's on-air disclosure that the palace demanded to see the full footage of the interview before making any comments. And Cooper reiterated that nobody at 60 Minutes does that. It's something they never do, so he thought that was wild that the palace would ask for that. But the palace cannot be expected to comment on something that if they don't know the full story. If it's all been edited out and they don't know how Harry really feels about things, like, not necessarily in a negative way. It could be that Harry was really fair in the interview about his family, but they choose to edit the parts where Harry is the most vehement, the most demanding, the most unpleasant about his family, so that makes better TV. If Harry comes at it in a way where he's being, fair and just honestly explaining his grievances, the way he sees it, the palace would want to be able to comment on Harry's character with the full understanding of what had happened, not just by what is edited and what makes good TV. But then, too, there's also the more negative side. Maybe Harry is extremely aggressive against the family. Maybe he said a lot of things that were, never make it into the final cut. And they also want to know, what are we playing with here? What game is he playing? How angry is he in reality? And so I don't blame them for not wanting to get into it. Should they have to consume the edited version like any other layman, and then somehow come up with a comment or response to that edited footage, which may not be a reflection of reality, of Harry's reality, of what Harry really thinks? So I don't think it was that crazy that they asked. Now, the palace stayed silent after the interview came out, but after its January 10th global release, King Charles made his feelings on the tell-all clear in private, despite not having read a page of the book, just as he refused to watch the Netflix series. Really quick, how do we know he didn't read the book? I find it really difficult to imagine that a parent would not read the memoir that their child had written that was so full of what it seems is the child's pain. Wouldn't you want to know what your child said, even if it was so hard to hear, or even to get somebody else to read it for you and be like, I can't even handle it. I'm scared to read how upset they are. Get somebody to read it for you and explain to you what they said if you truly can't handle it. But how does Omid Scobie know that King Charles never read a page of the book? How do you know what he's reading and what he's not reading? Are you privy to what's on his nightstand? What is happening that you think that you can't? He never even read a page of the book, never even saw the documentary. How do you know that? How do you know? There's a lot of hours a day when nobody's watching what the king's doing. The Sussex's team received correspondence from Buckingham Palace's keeper of the Privy Purse, Sir Michael John Stevens, who informed Harry and Meghan that as they were no longer working royals or based in Britain, they needed to give up the keys to their royal rental, Frogmore Cottage. Although there were reports to the contrary some months later, I spoke to a source close to the couple on the day they were informed, and there was a clear feeling of shock and disappointment as the news sunk in. Renovations at Frogmore had not only been repaid in full by the couple, $2.4 million in total, but they had also covered a lease on the property well into the future. Given that the couple was now banned from access to royal protection, even if they paid for it themselves, staying on the Windsor estate was the Sussex family's only truly safe option when visiting the United Kingdom, as the grounds are surrounded by armed guards. Several days later, Harry spoke about the matter with Charles over the phone. "Don't you want to see your grandchildren?" the Duke asked his father. His silence, followed by a half-hearted declaration that they would always have somewhere to stay, didn't, according to a source, give Harry much hope. Sir Michael followed up with a note that Harry would have until early June to clear out the entire residence and return the keys. Okay. Well, it is a royal rental, which means it's not your home. There's a part of me that thinks it is slightly unfair that they had a lease that they had signed and that they had done renovations to the place and that they were now being kicked out. But they're not working royals. So we can't apply the same rules that we would apply to regular life. I think that if they wanted to be there, would they not be there? You know, if they wanted to use Frogmore Cottage, then they would be there using it. But they're never there. And if you don't want to be part of the family, then you don't have the perks of being part of the family, which would include Frogmore Cottage. That place, that home, which cottage, I mean, this is not where Sleeping Beauty grew up out in the woods with a couple of fairies. This is a palatial mansion. And so if you don't want to use it, then it can be used by somebody else. However, as much as I think it was right for them to take the property away from Harry and Meghan, who are no longer part of the family, so should not receive the perks of the family, I'm not sure that I agree with what they decided to do with the property or what they had proposed to do with it. The book says the final blow came when the couple became aware that King Charles had offered the property to his disgraced brother Prince Andrew, who had spent the past 20 years living at the nearby 30-room Royal Lodge. In 2003, the disgraced prince had signed a 75-year lease on the property, renting it from the Crown Estate for the bargain price of just £250 a week, on the condition that he covered the costs of the many renovations it needed, which were about $7.5 million over 2 decades. Now that Andrew was no longer a working royal and didn't have any active financial endeavors bringing in money, there was talk that he could no longer afford to continue running the home, though he definitely told anyone who asked that he had it under control. For Charles, the issue of Frogmore Cottage wasn't just about punishing his son, though sources say that undoubtedly played a significant role. It was also part of the effort to streamline the portfolio of properties being used by members of the family. That seems to me the much more likely case. Why does he want to get into it with his son? He knows his son's already upset and at like a raw nerve. Why would he do something to just rub salt into it? That doesn't seem like Charles's character at all. We all knew that Charles was trying to make great public strides to show people we are not wasting your taxpayer dollars here. We're not just everybody having this huge home and people who aren't even here, taking these huge homes. He had already said he wanted to slim things down. So this makes common sense to say, okay, you can't have that property and you can't have that property because you're not even working for us anymore. Slimming down the monarchy also means slimming down the privileges and perks enjoyed by family members. Officially, offering the smaller 5-bedroom Frogmore Cottage to his younger brother was Charles' way of reducing the number of non-working royals paying discounted rent for grand properties. But the timing and the optics suggested this was also a punitive measure aimed at Harry and his family, one that smelled of bitterness and recrimination. Then, to add insult to injury, there was an eviction notice nailed on the front door of Frogmore, and it was surprisingly hailed as a strong decision by the usual chorus of reactionary royalists and royal reporters, says Scobie. But others in the media found Charles' Frogmore move petty, including the respected former BBC royal correspondent Peter Hunt. He said, instead of building bridges, the head of state is torching them, and the banishment of his son is cruel, unnecessary, and diminishes Charles. The banishment of his son is cruel, unnecessary, and diminishes Charles. Staying mum about Harry's accusations and remaining publicly unconcerned for his son's well-being while ending his family's lease on a safe UK residence was not a decisive action by a resolute king. It was a cheap shot from a wounded father bound by an institutional system that is often intolerant of human emotion. What the actual bleep? No, it isn't. Why should Harry have a 5-bedroom mansion on the properties of Windsor Estate just because he happens to relate to these people? He doesn't care about that relationship. What has he shown that he cares about them? And this continual talk about the banishment of his son is cruel. Harry exiled himself, if you even want to use that word. He decided he didn't want to be a member of the family. Nobody set him out to pasture and was like, never can you come back. So I don't think there was anything wrong with him taking away the property. I do think that to turn to Andrew and be like, we're going to cut you out of this place. You can't have Royal Lodge anymore. That's too much. And Harry, you can't have Frogmore anymore. But Andrew, if you want Frogmore, you can have it. No. Those two jokers need to be left out in the wind. Harry, you figure things out for yourself. And also Andrew, you too. Nobody should be offering him any place to lay his head under any royal roof. Mistakes that he has made in life, the foolish things that he has done in life, he now has to make do. He has to make do with what he's done. If he wants to run around with hugely scandalous people and take pictures with young girls and carry on in ways that are so unbecoming to him, scandalous, potentially criminal, he needs to bear the brunt of that. Nobody needs to be worried about where he lays his head. Figure it out, man. You figured out how to get to Epstein's Island, so figure this one out. It's just annoying to me that I have to say that I do share Scobie's frustration by the fact that Andrew seems not to have to bear the consequences within his own family. Now, I know he's been stripped of titles and a whole lot of things, but in my mind, that guy should be just left to figure it out. Like, there's the street, find your own way. Because you don't deserve for anybody to give you a helping hand. You don't. You made your choice when you decided to act in nefarious ways. You chose what your future would look like. So don't be sorry now that people are saying, well, the chickens have come to roost, figure it out. But to continue on with the Andrew narrative, offering Frogmore is another sign, according to Scobie, that the king won't completely banish Andrew from the picture. Taking advantage of Charles' brotherly bias, Andrew continued to turn down the keys to Frogmore for months until Sir Michael stopped asking him about it. And despite knowing the uproar that would come from the public, he slithered into an ermine robe for the March 2023 service for the Royal Victorian Order, an event that occurred every 4 years in the medieval St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle, and continued the ceremonial role that the Queen failed to take away from her son. Charles is aware that his brother wants to slowly step back into some sort of public role, even if it isn't as a working royal. He held his hands up and said, "I can't stop him," but it felt as if he didn't want to stop him, said a family source of Andrew's outing. Yeah. That guy should have no reason ever to put on any royal clothing whatsoever. Like, it should be anathema to any member of the royal family that Andrew should ever dress up as one of them and ever look like the family is okay with him at all. He needs to be banished. Many questioned the king's judgment, particularly coming on the heels of the Frogmore dust-up. Pundits called out Andrew for his brazen audacity and impertinence, including the outspoken former Liberal Democratic politician Norman Baker, who said that the palace allowed Andrew to, quote, play dressing up as a royal for the day, when really he should be serving a long period of silence. Considering the depths of Andrew's disgrace, whether or not the king quietly approved, or even made the final decision about the Duke's appearance at the service, is irrelevant. Andrew's mere presence in ceremonial royal garb was dramatically out of step with public opinion. More than that, it exposed Charles's weak need when it comes to his brother and his family in general. I think the thing, too, for the royals at this point is that Jimmy Seville, what's the name of that guy who was this real con man who was an absolute pedophile, and they had this long relationship with him, and the royal family all seemed like they were real chummy with this guy. They need to distance themselves from anything that smacks of child predator in their midst. They need to make sure, like, clear lines. We do not support that. We aren't secretly into that. Like, we have nothing to do with it. And for one of their very own, Andrew, to have been so mixed up with Epstein to such a excessive degree, the whole family needs to be like, we're against all of it. We don't want anything to do with anybody who might be a child predator. We renounce it. So just constantly sort of like, well, we took away some of his stuff. We're gonna... None of that. Well, we shift on to the very last pages of this, and we're going to discuss the fact that everything was going pretty badly for Charles, according to Scobie. Everyone was like, well, this guy's just, a really anticlimactic second act here. And he goes on to great lengths, of course, throughout this chapter to make that known to us. Circumvented by Netflix, overshadowed by his younger son, humbled by the government and the institutional system, and dragged down by his own poor judgment and that of his wayward brother, Charles often stumbled through his first 100 days as king, encountering one obstacle after another. It seemed he couldn't catch a break. But the monarch did just that at the tail end of an unusually rainy March. The king and Buckingham Palace officials were desperate to carry out the first international trip for the monarch and his consort, an ambassadorial mission to Europe. Now, for a variety of reasons, the only country he was able to visit was Germany. But the terrible timing and bad luck traps that Charles knows so well were also set again. The Duke of Sussex was at the High Court in London alongside Sir Elton John and other claimants for an unlawful news-gathering lawsuit against the publisher of the Daily Mail. And because it's Harry, this usually ignored type of hearing chummed the waters for yet another media frenzy. So everybody thought things were going to go really terrible. You know, he's trying to do his ambassadorial trip to Europe. The only country that he can manage to get to is Germany for whatever reason. And now his son's here with Sir Elton John drumming up a bunch of publicity, sitting around in court. And so people weren't sure how it would go. But after a rough start as king at home, Charles proved up for the job abroad. As head of state and a soft power emissary, he was commanding and unifying, even daringly unconventional, when the situation demanded it. But it's all for naught, because although Harry was still in the United Kingdom when he returned from Germany, Charles ignored a request to meet, instead instructing an aide to fob him off with a, quote, too busy excuse. As for the positive energy generated from the trip, it didn't last long. Charles found himself in the news for the wrong reasons once again, just 6 days later during a trip to York for his first Maundy-Thursday service as king. Well, apparently, when commemorating the Last Supper, it had become the tradition for the kings to hand out money. And after King Charles II handed out new minted silver coins in 1662, the alms were therefore called Maundy money. Duly obliged, the new King Charles carried on the ancient tradition by handing out 2 purses, one red, the other white, to 148 senior citizens, 74 men and 74 women, to recognize their services to the church or community, the 74 referring to Charles's age. All in all, it is a rather harmless, if slightly condescending tradition, one that Queen Elizabeth II made her own, as only she could do. It was always quite touching to see her perform the service, either as a young, wide-eyed English rose new to the job, or a venerated, battle-tested queen who embodied royal tradition. Charles performed his part of the service with requisite smiles and adequate respect, knowing that his mother especially cherished the event. But while greeting royals after unveiling a statue of his late mother, Charles experienced something that the late queen never did at a Maundy-Thursday service. Eggs hurled in protest. Although smaller in number to those gathered in support, a group of anti-monarchy protests at the engagement were active and loud, with one shouting at Charles, "This country was built on the blood of slaves!" As yolks spattered across the ground, some well-wishers tried to drown out the protesters' boos with chants of "God save the King!" The young man was quickly arrested and later sentenced to 100 hours of community service. The king might have wowed crowds in Germany, but back at home he faced mixed reception, to put it mildly. Nobody cares about a couple of egg throwers. There's always going to be some joker in the crowd who doesn't know his place in society. The chapter ends again on the note about Andrew. 3 days after the egg missiles, Charles led members of the royal family into Windsor St. George's Chapel for the Easter Sunday service. Practically front and center in the group was Prince Andrew, glum but arrogant. The Duke of York strode tall next to his sister Princess Anne and one step behind King Charles. Prince William and Kate, the Princess of Wales, purposefully kept their distance. But Charles appeared unconcerned, still blithely unaware of the message this sends to the public. The king seemed surprisingly comfortable dragging the baggage of the past into the monarchy's new era. As the Queen told Harry a few years earlier, "Your father always does what he wants to do." Charles has finally got his chance, and only he can squander it. Okay, so that's the end of that chapter. I did enjoy that chapter slightly more than the last two, but only because I felt like there was some points in which I could sort of agree with him. And often it just gets wearying to just be like, this is dumb, this is dumb, this is dumb, because all right already, enough of that. But I have to say, I don't completely disagree with the points he made about Charles and Charles's attitude regarding the pens on multiple occasions. You know, just hours between the two events. 40 hours is not a long time to sort of like forget that the world is not over the first time you freaked out about a pen. So to then do something so similar 48 hours later is sketchy. I do think that Scobie belabored the point about King Charles and the pens. There was an aggressive amount of conversation about it. But I still say that the points that he made about Andrew, I stand with him on that. He could have talked to me for 10 pages about that and I'd have been like, yes, amen. Yes and amen to all of it. Preach, brother. Because Andrew is a scoundrel and a snake and should have no position whatsoever in the royal family. And they should be offended that he even thinks that he has a place in the family anymore. I mean, deeply offended. That joker needs to get out of town. And the family needs to run him out on a rail. So I'm fine. Anything Omid Scobie wants to say against Andrew, I'm fine with it. And if you guys know a part of it about Andrew that I'm just, I'm being super unfair or something, feel free to tell me. But I mean, I'm going to have to be given some real evidence before I agree with even saying some positive things about him. He seems like he has had he seems like he's been out of control for years. And I'll tell you something right now. Andrew Lowney, the author of The Mountbattens and Trader King, is writing a book about Prince Andrew. And I cannot wait to read it. It's going to be amazing. I mean, because we know that he can do some research. He can find the stories no one else has. And I can't wait. And I don't think that there's anybody who is honest with themselves who feels like Andrew has any place in the royal family to be even seen with them at all. So that's my feelings there. But anyway, this was, I thought this chapter was more interesting. We'll see what we can come up with. Again, we're just going to kind of jump around on this book. I don't know that we're going to, well, I don't know. I do know. We're not going to cover every single chapter in detail. We're just not going to do it. We don't have the time. We don't have the inclination. But with some things, we'll talk about some things. But then when better books come, I'm not 100% sad about potentially leaving this one by the wayside. It's a real waste of time, honestly. All right. Well, it was good talking with you guys, and I'll see you later this week. Also, if you did not catch the Get Ready With Me video that I posted, if you like just like random chit chats, I'm like just talking about like our new life, why I left the school that I was teaching at, how I'm homeschooling the boys, our new house. Like I kind of talk about it, not a ton. I kind of mentioned the whole debate thing that happened with Trump and Biden, how I just feel like the world is upside down now. And then, let's see, what was the last thing I talked about? I talked a little bit about Omid Scobie and this chapter we were going to do. So anyway, if you like that kind of video, there's another one of those. There's one of those out. But if you're like, I don't need to sit here and watch you put on your makeup and talk randomly and meanderingly about one thing or another, skip it. All right, I'll talk to you guys later. Bye.